Good afternoon, and thank you for joining the Duke Initiative for Science and Society for the next installment of our Coronavirus Conversation series, co-hosted today with Duke's Plus Data Science program and Harvard University's Petrie-Flom Center for Bioethics. My name is Andrew Parasak, and I'm a research analyst here at Science and Society. In a moment, I'll introduce the speakers and moderator for today's event, which will examine the ethics issues around using wearable technology for COVID-19 detection, response, and monitoring. But first, just a few housekeeping notes. If you have any questions for our panelists, please send them to Ben Shepard using the chat function at the bottom of the screen. He will redirect those questions to our moderator, who will try to address as many as possible. Please make sure to keep your video off and your microphone muted throughout the event. And if you happen to lose connection at any point during the event, you can rejoin by clicking on the link in the email you received earlier today. After the event, I invite you to visit the Science and Society website, scienceandsociety.duke.edu, to learn about our upcoming coronavirus conversations. On Monday, August 24th, the Science and Ethics of Human Challenge Trials for COVID-19. On Thursday, August 27th, racial bias in the healthcare system and how that impacts COVID-19 outcomes. And on Wednesday, September 2nd, ethics considerations around dating, relationships, and sex during the pandemic. While you are on the Science and Society website, you can also learn about our master's degree program, where our students and faculty go in depth on the very science, technology issues we have discussed the past few months in these coronavirus conversations. So please allow me to introduce our panelists. Dr. Jessilyn Dunn is an assistant professor of biomedical engineering at Duke's Pratt School of Engineering, an assistant professor of biostatistics and bioinformatics at the Duke School of Medicine, and a member of the Duke Clinical Research Institute. Her research focuses on the use of large-scale biomedical datasets to model and guide personalized therapies. She is the faculty lead of the Big Ideas Lab, which aims to develop and test tools and infrastructure using biomedical and health data for early detection, intervention, and prevention of disease. Dr. Dunn is also a co-lead of Duke's COVE-Identify project, which investigates whether data from your smartphone or smartwatch can help determine if you have COVID-19 and how severe the infection could get. I'm sure we will hear more about that project today. Dr. Marielle S. Gross is an assistant professor of Obstetrics, Gynecology, and Reproductive Sciences at the University of Pittsburgh. She received her M.D. with honors in research from University of Florida's College of Medicine in 2014 and completed her residency in Gynecology and Obstetrics at the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine in 2018. Her research focuses on the application of technology and elimination of bias as means of promoting evidence basis, equity, and efficiency in women's healthcare. She explores the ethics of health data and implementation of learning health systems via emerging technologies, and she focuses on dismantling prejudice-based medicine, policies and practices which are not evidence-based and which tend to exacerbate disparities. In May 2020, she co-authored a white paper with Harvard's Edmund J. Saffer Center for Ethics titled Ethical Implementation of Wearables in Pandemic Response, a Call for a Paradigm Shift. And I'm sure we will likewise hear about that paper today too. And our moderator today is Dr. Nida Farahani, who is the founding director of Duke's Initiative for Science and Society, the Robinson O. Everett Professor of Law at the Duke Law School, a professor of philosophy, and the chair of the Duke M.A. in Bioethics and Science Policy. She is a leading scholar on the ethical, legal, and social implications of emerging technologies. She served on the Presidential Commission for the Study of Bioethical Issues from 2010 through 2017, currently serves, to name a few, as an elected member of the American Law Institute, president-elect and board member of the International Neuroethics Society, and a member of the Neuroethics Working Group of the U.S. BRAIN Initiative. Dr. Farahani is a chair-elect of the section of jurisprudence for the Association of American Law Schools, a co-editor-in-chief and co-founder of the Journal of Law and the Biosciences, and an editorial board member of the American Journal of Bioethics Neuroscience. With that, I will yield the floor to Dr. Farahani to begin the conversation.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you to everybody who's joining us today, and especially to our panelists, to Dr. Gross and Dr. Dunn for being here with us. I couldn't imagine two better experts to have this conversation with today, to talk about both facts as well as the broader ethical and legal issues with respect to wearable devices as part of our pandemic response. And it's a particularly apt time to be having this conversation because, of course, wearables aren't just being used for pandemic purposes, they're being used in nearly every part of society. People have started to adopt wearables. If you look at the growth of wearable devices in the US as well as worldwide, it is skyrocketing. People wear Apple Watches, they carry Fitbits, they wear rings and other devices that track their every movement, their heart rates. and different types of information from them, biometric information that they're sharing with corporations. What's different, of course, is whether or not these wearable devices are voluntarily being chosen by individuals versus becoming a mandatory part of their everyday lives. So to have that conversation, I thought it'd be really useful for us to start with Dr. Dunn, who has an important study on the use of wearable devices in the pandemic, to tell us a little bit about that study, but particularly to tell us what role can wearables actually play in the pandemic? Because, of course, we're all desperate for ways to be able to more quickly identify people who may have either asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic COVID at this point. And so if wearables can be part of that solution, that's exciting. And then, of course, the question is how we can do so responsibly. So can you tell us a little bit about how wearables are being used in your study and what the promise is that they could offer?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks very much, Nita, for having us and for hosting the questions. So the Co-Identify study, the goal is to develop something that we call digital biomarkers of illness. And in this particular case, we're looking at doing that specifically for COVID-19. I think the idea of digital biomarkers is not particularly new with COVID. We've actually, my lab has been focused on the development of digital biomarkers since our start. So we've been doing this for a couple of years. And really the idea there is that we have these wearable devices, like you mentioned, that perform physiologic monitoring, really. We're getting measurements about heart rate, movement, sometimes temperature, sometimes blood pressure, a variety of different types of measurements continuously and longitudinally. And so it's really quite powerful because when we think about, the first thing that happens when you go for a primary care appointment, your vitals get taken, right? And so this is a method of taking vitals continuously to try to monitor what's going on with people. So in particular for this Co-Identify study, we realized, as soon as COVID-19 was reaching the US shores, that there was an obvious application for wearables here. That we've seen in the past with our own studies that in influenza, in other types of infectious disease and in chronic disease, physiology changes and we can detect that. Some of the challenges are that there's a lot of personalization aspects to this, that different people's physiology changes differently. And in fact, with outcomes, we see that pretty clearly. And so what our study is designed to do is to monitor people who own wearables, or we've been working on trying to get funding to actually hand out wearables, and pair that with daily symptom surveys, where if somebody reports feeling sick, we ask questions about the illness that they're feeling and try to build models to predict based on somebody's physiology whether or not they have COVID, and if they do have COVID, how bad is it going to get?
Great. And for the devices that you're using right now, you said you're measuring a number of different physiological markers. So I assume heart rate, temperature, is that something that you're also monitoring?
So it depends on the device. We take in data from a lot of different devices. So we can take in data from Garmin, Fitbit, or any device that pairs with Apple Health Kit. So that means that there are some devices that do measure temperature. There are some devices that measure SpO2. There are some devices that only measure heart rate or only measure steps. So it's a very, what we call multimodal data set, lots of different types of data.
That sounds challenging. Is it consistent across each of the different devices? Meaning, if I have, an Apple Watch that I'm wearing versus a Fitbit, and both of them are measuring the number of steps that I take per day. And I assume one of the things you could measure would be like, how active am I? Am I suddenly, fatigued and dropping off my activity, or sleeping much more, things like that? Are you going to get the same measurement between the Apple Watch and the Fitbit, or are there variations between devices as well?
So there are variations between devices, and prior to this, we published a study actually early this year in January of a head-to-head comparison of several different devices, and we were looking at their performance under a variety of devices, including under different movement conditions, across skin tones. And what we saw was that there are differences in the way devices perform. So that definitely adds another variable to our analyses. in trying to take advantage of the fact that there are a lot of different devices out there, which gives us more data, but the fact that not all devices are created equal.
Okay, and I assume people are opting into your study, right? So it's people who already have devices. You mentioned that you hopefully will get funding that you can distribute devices, but right now it's people who already own devices, who are voluntarily wearing the devices, who are opting into the study to share the data with you in order to be able to identify some information. Is that fair?
Yeah, so we've actually recently gotten a small grant to be able to hand out some devices. So we have actually started handing out about 400 devices. So at the start of our study, we didn't have that funding. So it was really a bring your own device model. And you know, as I hope we'll get to at some point, that causes a lot of skewed demographics. We knew that would happen. But our choices were kind of not to run the study or to run the study with skewed demographics. And we really wanted to launch and give ourselves the opportunity to be able to get funding to have a more equitable distribution of devices. So now we have the ability to hand out some devices. I hope we get to the point where we can hand out a lot more.
Great. But so I think that's great. And we're going to get into the demographics for sure. But I just wanted to kind of put out there as one of the facts. So these are all of the data that you're getting right now is from individuals who are opting in rather than from corporations, right? So you're not going to Apple and saying, share all of the data with us, but instead the user who is elected to wear an Apple device or one of the other devices who's chosen to participate in the study and chosen to share the information directly with you through an app that's collecting the information like that. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Great. Okay. And so that gives us a little bit of context, and it's early days, I assume still. So you are collecting a lot of this data. Are there any promising results so far to suggest that there are biomarkers or digital biomarkers that you can start to identify to, you know, identify somebody before they've actually developed symptoms of COVID-19?
So it is definitely early days. You know, I think I use this analogy a lot of that we are building the plane while we're flying it here. This is not a typical way that we do studies. So it's been very challenging to get all of the infrastructure up and running. We have started to look at the way that we've kind of started our exploratory analysis is through case studies. And in fact, we are finding some case studies with really clear examples. The challenge with COVID is that because there are such dramatically different presentations, it makes it that much more difficult to come up with a common digital biomarker. And we're actually coming to the point where we see that that may not even be possible. We may actually need to develop some more personalized methods. So it's early days, but there are some promising results as we go.
Okay, terrific. Well, let me bring Dr. Gross into the conversation. So Dr. Gross published an important paper thinking about the ethical implementation of the wearables in the pandemic. And she cites, to begin with, a couple of other examples, perhaps a little bit less voluntary than those that you're taking, Dr. Dunn, about the use of wearable devices. And so, Dr. Gross, I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about those examples. You had given the example of South Korea and the use in South Korea of the devices and where they ended up, given that people were kind of figuring out ways to circumvent the tracking that was happening. And then we can get into the second example that I think is a really valuable one that's happening in the US as well with the rings that you discuss in your study.
Yeah, thanks. Almost to take a step back, I think, you know, wearables as this really interesting category of devices that are literally on, like, when they're worn on the body, which sounds like exactly why they're called wearables, but the significance, sort of the ethical, moral significance of that, I think is kind of lost on us in a way because they're so omnipresent in our culture now.
Yeah.
And to have a device on your body, on your physical self, that is constantly collecting and recording and sometimes transmitting data, analyzing data about you, is really unprecedented and extremely intimate. And so I just kind of like put that as sort of as a backdrop thought for everybody. And I think, you know, broadly speaking, there's two kinds of wearables as in the pandemic response, big categories. One is GPS or Bluetooth related location-based wearables, which you could think of almost like the classic like ankle monitor, right, for the home prisoner. The other big category is Dr. Dunn's category, which are typically voluntary devices, but they're biometric in nature. So they're not focusing on the location, which is more of a contact tracing strategy. They're focused on biometrics, which is more about early warning, testing, treatment, or prevention strategy. So there's sort of two classes of wearables and two major strategies that they represent. And of course, they almost all, the most advanced devices really have both. So, and in theory, we would want to leverage both, for the most utility, we would want to leverage both of those features, both where people are, who they are in contact with, and their, biometric data that can clue us into their potential illness. So that's sort of the kind of big, I think, like, categorization as far as I see it. There is I can give maybe a list of the major ethical issues that I think kind of.
Well, but before we go there, which I want to get into. I was hoping you could just give the South Korea example,
right,
because I think it's a really powerful one, just to help people understand before we get into the ethics and some of the concerns that you've raised.
Yeah, sorry, that's right. You did ask about that. So the example that she's referring to is the GPS, or the location-based data example, which was implemented kind of a very early on in the pandemic, which is a place that was sort of almost revered amongst the public health community as really effectively squashing the epidemic or pandemic at that point, is that they really were able to shut it down. A lot of that it's unclear to the extent to which it was truly because of their use of wearables, but certainly a lot of it was attributed to that. And in GPS setting, in South Korea setting, I think it really does help illustrate the concerns that emerge. So initially it was started out for the purpose of, contact tracing and to sort of help people who were self-reporting illness or that were diagnosed to then have their sort of contact tracing followed. And they had, individual, it was almost as technologically savvy as it sounds. It really wasn't that technological, because there were these very lo-fi GPS devices that were these bracelets or phones and people would have to go to their homes to confirm their symptoms or different things like that for their quarantine. And of course, because of how many people in COVID are asymptomatic or minimally symptomatic, that meant a lot of people who felt basically well, who would have gone to work that day, for example, were forced to stay home, or maybe they wanted to do other things that day. And so as a result, people were leaving their devices, their smartphone on the table at home, made it seem like they were home, but then going about their day. And of course, that was not helping the pandemic. And so as a result of that, the sort of government initiated enforcement, where basically users were forced to maintain the devices on their person at penalty of, variety of potential penalties under the law. And so I think that that's the, very 1984 esque sort of version of how those GPS trackers can go under actual house arrest, just like you would imagine being with a traditional ankle monitor. But it was enforced by the government. And so that's sort of this classic specific government for this data, and to really take away liberty in a very real sense.
So I think it's going to be really useful for us to dive in, right? To help people understand the harm, because I think, which is, people have a comfort level with the wearable devices because I think it's become very normalized, right? So everybody carries a cell phone with them or a mobile device with them, and they know that that's transmitting their GPS location, and that's become such a normalized part of our everyday culture that, we share our location with everybody. I have an Apple iPhone, and it has the Find My feature on it, and everybody in my family has shared with each other where it is, and we'll ping each other and be like, what are you doing at so-and-so's house, or why are you there? And it's just normalized now for a lot of people to share that information. They share it with their friends, they share it with other people. People have started to wear these Apple devices, and I don't think they necessarily contemplate both what the potential harms are that could arise for them, or think about the intimacy of the information that's being collected, which is different than information that has been collected in the past. But the question is, what could be done with that information, right? I mean, should we be worried? So it is more intimate in that it didn't used to be the case that you could know my location at 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, nor could you know my heart rate 24/7 or my temperature 24/7 or the number of steps I've taken or whether I'm inside or outside or the kind of different pieces of information. But what's the harm of people knowing that information? And one could be, as you've mentioned, right, the South Korea example, which is, quickly it can go from people opting in, like people have opted into Dr. Dunn's study, to it being mandated, right? You don't have a choice anymore. You have to wear one of these devices and you have to share that information. But I think it's useful for us to say, well, let's assume that future. Let's assume that we get to the point where everybody has to wear one of these devices. Should we be worried? What can people learn from that information? And what's the potential discrimination or kind of risk that arises from the loss of privacy, aside from the ickiness factor, right? The ickiness of like somebody's monitoring my very heart rate at every moment of the day, kind of, so what if they can't do anything with that information, or can they? And so you've contemplated this, I think, Dr. Dunn, about what some of the issues are with respect to collecting the data of your research subjects. And I know, Dr. Gross, you've contemplated it as part of this, and you've included some examples of the potential harms that could arise. And so either one of you that wants to jump in here, what do you think the risk is, assuming we get to a world in which it's a mandatory thing, whether it's by governments or corporations, or your employer says you have to wear one 24/7 if you want to come to work anymore? What could happen?
Yeah.
Who wants to jump in on that? You want to jump in first?
Sure. Yeah. So I think, you raised so many really interesting threads that I want to pull on all at once. But the one that kind of floats to the top the most is what you describe as this casual nonchalance with which we many of us have treated giving up privacy that our parents, for example, would have, to have that ick factor, that just almost an intergenerational component to this, where, younger generations have accepted a different level of privacy as a norm. And it's, I think that what's really interesting to me, and there's a lot of interesting aspects related to that, I think that a good part of it is reflecting the way with which these devices were introduced. It's been like a bait and switch, right? Both like kind of all the way through. So for example, the device that's introduced as a way, the Ring, which is the other example that is, I like it, it's a clean example because it's not a smartphone, which is not, it's something you have on your person often, but is not technically worn. So I really focus on things like a Fitbit or a Ring. The Oura Ring is a really interesting example as a device introduced to help people optimize their sleep. It's a general wellness, legal category, general wellness, under the federal trade, under FTC rather than FDA approval. It's not a medical device. It's not held to the same standards in terms of, to me, what one of the first major categories of ethical concerns, which is I think what, Jessilyn is really focusing on, which is the validity of the data that's being collected. I mean, that's like ground floor, like, are they valid? They're not held to these same level of concerns. Then once they're disseminated into the population, then they're suddenly being repurposed for something that is healthcare, affecting health decision making, that does sort of in no way escapes any of the classic definitions of medical devices. If you look at the actual, I mean, Nita could please correct me if I'm wrong, but to me, they fit the way that a medical device would be defined. That's the bait and switch, is that they were introduced as these, that's another aspect, is the consumer introduction, then being traded into a political or public, or even like the commercial use of that data, the consumer use of that data versus its use for public health sort of, or government, run purposes is another way. Like, there's been a lot of slides, like, I'm not generally a slippery slope person, but there's been a lot of slides from one category of things to implementational role. Now that everybody has a Fitbit, now we're going to start using it for completely different purposes. We kind of mothered in under all of these things, assuming that the, you know, that the data is valid, assuming that, you know, that it's valid for all people and, you know, in various circumstances, et cetera, which, you know, we weren't subject kind of testing that we would have been had we tried to introduce this as a COVID detection device, right? Because we were talking about, you know, something that was.
So they're not medical devices right now, right? But they could be. So part of wearables, you know, the FDA in the US and in other countries, as they look at medical device oversight, the intention of the manufacturers is part of what determines whether or not it is a medical device, whether it's used to diagnose or treat a condition. And most of these devices were not used originally. Right? I mean, if you're using it for entertainment purposes or using it for fitness purposes, it's different than if you're using it to diagnose or treat a condition. Once you start to market it for diagnosing or treating a condition, or once it actually does start to be used that way, then the FDA can exercise greater oversight and they can treat it as a medical device if they choose to do so. But I want Dr. Dunn to comment on the accuracy concerns, because this is one of course, the ethical issues is, and this arises a lot with algorithms, and particularly algorithmic kind of clinical decision-making, the use of them. And you mentioned already one of the potential limitations already, which is the demographics, right? So if you have a biased data set potentially, do you have differences in the utility of what you've ultimately developed, right? And are there risks that arise from that, from healthcare decision-making? And you know, right now, presumably, you have sort of some insights as to whether or not you think that we're likely to be able to validate these, but then also what's the risk that arises if they are invalid? What's kind of the concerns that might arise from having inaccurate information? So do you want to comment on that in light of some of the research that you've done?
Sure, absolutely. And I think also I'd love to just touch back upon that, the point that you made, you know, what if we lived in a world where, you know, everybody was kind of forced to wear a device and it was continuously collecting data like this? I do want to throw in kind of like an alternate possibility for these devices, which has to do with these algorithms, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that the way that the devices are designed, they do collect data. That data doesn't necessarily need to be saved and stored. And so I think that that's an interesting point that we can think about, that if we live in this world, and also there are these algorithms that are pretty effective at saying whether or not somebody has COVID or some other disease, we could envision a world where those devices actually sit on body, on people, are not actually allowed to collect data, but can run algorithms in real time. Now, there are caveats there because some algorithms require historical data, so they might not be as effective, but this is a possibility that we could think about. So
is that what you're doing with your research? So does your research require stored data right now?
Yes and no. So we're exploring a lot of different avenues. You know, when we talk about personalized medicine, one of the things that we learn is that we can develop these sort of personal baselines, that something that might be an abnormal measurement for you isn't necessarily an abnormal measurement for me. So we do need to have some sort of personalized baseline to compare with. But what that looks like can change on the level of granularity of the data. So we don't necessarily need to know what your heart rate measurement is at every minute of every day, but we might be able to develop some baseline method. So I guess the short answer there is, you know, we're in early days with a lot of this algorithm development. And then I think to your question of, you know, how accurate is this information? How accurate are these algorithms? We're still working on the research side of this. So, you know, we've seen a lot of cases where we can get these things to work pretty well. We never have perfect sensitivity and specificity, neither do molecular diagnostic tests. But it really is critical that the tools that we're using take measurements that are verified and are valid. And in fact, we've been working with the Digital Medicine Society to develop this framework for evaluation of what we call biomets, or biometric monitoring technologies, to say, you know, how do we ensure that the measurements that are coming off of these devices are accurate, and what does accurate mean? What gold standards are we comparing to? Are there gold standards for these types of measurements? So we've tried to lay out kind of a framework for how with the evaluation of these tools.
It seems to me.
So I mean, I think, but between, sorry, let me say one thing quickly, and which is, it seems like between what you're both saying, right? Right now, one of the concerns would be validating the data. And I think that Dr. Gross is concerned that potentially without having validated data and without having regulatory oversight in countries like the United States that aren't classifying a lot of these devices as medical devices, that you might have an employer, for example, choose to exclude somebody from the workplace based on inaccurate data. Or you may have somebody labeled or stigmatized. I mean, still, despite the fact that it's such a widespread, virus, I think people feel like there's a stigmatization in some circles with having developed or come down with COVID-19. And so I think there's concerns that people have about, are you inaccurately stigmatized? Are you inaccurately labeled? But there's a different and interesting concern that Dr. Gross raises in her white paper, which is what happens when the data is monitored and stored over a long period of time, and who has access to that information, and could they make non-COVID related types of things about you. So for example, the natural variations that Dr. Dunn was talking about and what your baseline is. If you've stored your baseline temperature and you're a woman of reproductive years and you have a shift in your temperature, you could figure out where a person was in their menstrual cycle. And you could also figure out whether or not they were pregnant, because their temperature would go up, would shift up. They'd have a kind of, they'd go up a little at ovulation, and then it would continue to climb, and then they'd have a new baseline, which would be suggestive of either an illness or pregnancy. And they'd either have to reveal that they were pregnant or potentially be misclassified as having COVID, and then could they be discriminated against for those reasons? So these are some, I think, of the issues that have been identified as potential misattribution. Are there others? Are there other concerns that arise from the storing and watching of this data? Are there other ways in which we think people could be discriminated against, or there are risks to having access to this information?
I mean, I think, yeah, there's so many that come to mind. There's so much here. What one of the cases I think about is a classic bioethics case of the Havasupai Nation, which is a really good example of it's a Native American group that agreed to do genomic testing for the purpose of something that they're very affected by in their community. And there was some fine print that, that data could be used for other sorts of biomedical research. And subsequent research was done on their genetic lineage, demonstrating that their origins were not where their sort of origins said that they were from, and on other diseases, specifically psychiatric conditions that were highly stigmatized. And the community was devastated and appropriately outraged by the sort of insufficiency, I think, of the informed consent that they provided. And it's such a good case for, I think, highlighting how, the intention of the device user and the informed consent that the users, or the device manufacturer, and the informed consent that the users provide are, even in the best case scenario, not able to fully the potential future uses, especially given the role of machine learning, AI, things like this. Like, we don't even know what the potential uses of that data are, even if all of our intentions are good, right?
So one question we have already from the audience about this, just kind of contemplating it, is it possible that we could have a kind of biometric fingerprint? Meaning, could you translate all of this information such that each person has a unique biometric fingerprint that could ultimately be could be used by law enforcement, could be used for screening or validation? Is that a possible future?
I think it is, and I think that it highlights one of the big, there's a lot of disparities related concerns here, but that specific concern related to, unequal criminalization for say, Black Americans. So you were in that location at that time. That's how you end up in this lineup. That's how you end up then, under arrest by sort of retrofit. It's like retrofitting all of this available data that's publicly collected and available somehow, despite its.
Well, so Dr. Dunn then raises this interesting point, and you do too in the paper, which is maybe there are different ways to store the data, or maybe there are ways to not store the data, right? There may be options such that algorithms could be simply accessing in real time the information that's being collected by the wearable devices. They could not be stored. And you also posit a number of other different potential models. I wonder if Dr. Dunn could elaborate a little bit about what you meant by algorithms that could just query what your current real-time status is, and if that could be used for COVID-19, if that would be a potential model that both you could explore and that other researchers ought to explore, and what the limitations might be. Because I also want us to keep in mind as we talk about all of this, that while there are risks, there's also great benefits, right? If this works, if a simple wearable device, like if I could wear an Apple Watch, or pick your much less expensive wearable device that I could wear at all times, and that device could alert me before I am symptomatic of COVID-19 and not spread it to my family or to other people, and others could do the same, that could have huge game-changing effects for where we are in society. So could you comment a little on the potential for this kind of real-time querying as an approach?
Yeah, and I think one strong distinction I want to make is between research and implementation, right? Because I think a lot of the ideas that we're touching upon right now are really in the research phases. And although I think Dr. Gross is right that a lot of this data is being collected and stored and could potentially be used for other purposes, I think when we're talking about the algorithm development in the case of developing digital biomarkers, this is research. So much like that genetic story that you just mentioned, where data that's collected for research was used in a way it was not intended by the research participants to be used, that's something that we have to be very careful of, right? And we have IRBs, we have informed consents to handle this. So there is oversight on the way that we design research such that participants should be informed about exactly what's happening with their data. So in the context of different methods that we could use to build algorithms and how those could use data either in real time or stored data, there's certainly a possibility that you would not need to store data, that you would be able to develop an algorithm that could take data in real time, compute upon it, and produce an output. Whether you store that output is another choice. But in this V3 framework, the way we talk about this is sort of a data supply chain. That it's almost like you could think about it as truck stops. There are points along the way where data gets transmitted on a device. So you can think about the circuitry of the device itself, where there's compute happening, and then past the device. So when it's Bluetooth connected to a mobile device, when that mobile device is connected to the cloud, there's data transfers that are occurring. And at every step of the way, engineers make choices about what happens there. So there are infinite possibilities about what could be done. It's just a matter of what the research shows us works.
Yeah, I want to push back against this whole idea that in any way the informed consent, whether it's consumers for their privacy provisions that they're agreeing to and participating in even the commercial use of these devices, or even our research informed consent, is given the completely different landscape of data and the completely different sort of ecosystem in which data is created, that any of this informed consent is meaningful. I call it accepting the cookies, right? Which is, I think, a good, people.
I think there's two different ones we should differentiate, right? Which is opting into corporate collection of data, which I think for the most part looks like yes, 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 right? I mean, it's just blanket consent that you're providing without reading the terms of service. Versus what I hope is research-based consent for participating in a research study. Now, it gets complicated, Dr. Gross, right? Because if you start thinking about a lot of the research that's being conducted by corporations, where you have an app on your phone that says, do you want to opt in to sharing your information with, pick your company? and that turns out to mean that you're sharing your data much more broadly than you realized,
Like
then the question is, right, and these are not your traditional these are not your traditional researchers, right? So as we shift from institutional-based researchers like Dr. Dunn at a place like Duke to large corporations who were not the traditional healthcare safeguarders of data. They're not covered entities. They're not the ones who are covered by traditional institutional review boards that are tied to institutions. What does it look like? And is it the same kind of consent by consumers? I think it can be very problematic in that context, right?
I think it's a false dichotomy.
Yeah, how come?
Well, first of all, there's so much transaction between so much of this data, especially like, for example, HIPAA, right? So this data not covered under HIPAA because when we're speaking about these commercial devices that are collecting biometric data that were not healthcare devices or they're not covered entities, all of that not being under HIPAA, it's like, why does that in any way, like, why is that data not, meeting the same criteria? And so much of that data, for example, even data collected within, even say you got a device like a Holter monitor, right? Another like classic wearable from your doctor, and that data can be de-identified and then sold by your healthcare system to, companies that are that are trying to develop a better wearable device that then they want to sell to you directly. So
do you think it's sensitive information? I mean, so I agree with you, right? I mean, traditionally, like, I wouldn't have my heart rate information. I wouldn't have a lot of the information that we're collecting from wearable devices without having gone to the doctor's office. And it would have, under the traditional previous model of collecting that data, that all would have been protected, at least in the United States, as health protected information. And the question is, now that we have, as some people say, democratized the collection of this information, right? Everybody can collect the information at home. And to Dr. Dunn's point, not everybody, and we're going to get to the demographic issues in a moment. But it's much more widespread that people can more cheaply at home be able to collect this information. Is it sensitive? Should it be protected in the same way as HIPAA is being protected, or should we stop thinking of this information as even sensitive information and be comfortable sharing it more broadly?
I mean, I think of it as the digital representation of the human body, which as a gynecologist, you're such an expert on privacy with level of knowledge about privacy from a formal philosophical and legal stance that I will never be able to even come near. But I have a very interesting insight into privacy, which comes from my work as a gynecologist, which is what I do every day, is totally attuned to the embodiment of ourselves and how our bodies are exposed. And to me, it's very transparent how the digital specimen is really truly this digital representation of the human body. Disrespecting it disrespects the body that it represents. And the closer and the more data, the more triangulated, the more granular it gets, the more, that's true. I always think about this, the classic textbook of a pathology picture where it's a person in their underwear looking really not great with a box over their eyes. And it's like, oh, you can't identify them, but is that picture respecting them just because you can't identify them? Kind of there.
So it's a dignitary harm from your perspective. Yeah. It's one of the concerns that arises from the kind of constant collection of this information is a loss of autonomy and dignity of individuals.
I think that's where our special treatment of health data comes from in the first place, is the dignitary harm, is like, that's what straight from like Hippocratic Oath, that's what it's about, is the sacred secrets that we learn in people's homes, is that we don't go black. And actually that leads to the point that Dr. Dunn brought up, which I think is really interesting because it's the first tier on what I've developed as sort of a 3-tier way of thinking of this strategy for moving forward. Like, how can we get the benefits without the harms? And I actually file it under what I consider like the right to be forgotten from the GDPR. And to me, step 1 is do not record. So that was what Dr. Dunn brought up, was like, do not record I think about this in terms of my data all the time. What of my patient's data am I not going to write down in the medical record? Just let it go. Then the next is, you know, do not reveal. So now, so this is sort of what gets into these high-tech sort of potential solutions. So one of the biggest problems with our willingness to give up our privacy because of the perceived benefits is that there's this broad assumption that we have to give up privacy in order to reap the benefits of our collective data. And that's false now. It was not false in the past. It was very reasonable and true, but it's no longer true because of advanced technologies. For example, zero knowledge proofs is basically a very sort of advanced form of mathematics, enable you to learn about study data, find conclusions about collective sets of data without ever accessing or seeing that data. So that.
Do you have concerns about the reproducibility? So, and I say this, which is, you highlight some really important and great strategies within your white paper, from keeping the data decentralized to the zero knowledge proofs to the potential for mediating engines for data that could safeguard the data. These all seem like really great strategies. I wonder, and this is my naivete about this work. So my understanding for zero knowledge proofs is, you know, if I'm Amazon and I want to know if my consumer data that I've collected is validated against Google's data, that I could do that by having the algorithm, you know, test at some intermediary my data, compare it to their data. I'd never have to see their data, and then it would just return some result to me, right? So I would never have to actually see their data.
That's more of the federated learning. So that's more of the decentralized, keeping data decentralized, which, so for example, with Dr. Dunn's stuff, it would be keeping your data on device.
Yeah.
And so that federated learning is technology that, if you ever wondered why autocorrect on your text messages works so fast, is because it's not beaming up to the cloud and back. It's all of the algorithms that are based on learning from all of our texting is being performed on your own phone. That's why.
And so how does the zero knowledge proof work?
So zero knowledge proofs is different in that zero knowledge proofs is about, so in federated learning, you send algorithms to data, and then the algorithms go from data set to data set, say private data set to private data set. Nobody has to see anybody else's data set, but they can reap the benefits of the collective value. The zero knowledge proofs is about, say, proving, I mean, it's mathematics, right? I mean, this stuff is very new, and it's scary.
Well, let me pause on the federated data before you expound, which is, what happens if somebody has falsified data locally? Does it just, like, does it get revealed with this federated data model? Because I worry about the quality of the data if there's nobody to audit it.
That's where blockchains come in.
Okay, right.
Speaking of like audit.
Okay, so zero knowledge proofs.
Yeah, so zero knowledge proofs. This stuff is really hard to wrap your mind around, blockchain too. But zero knowledge proofs is, imagine, you know, you have, I think always in terms of medical data, so I'm thinking you have a medical record, and I want to know, I want to run some, I want to find out some sort of conclusions based on analyzing your medical record regarding whether or not you should take medicine Z, right? And the idea of zero knowledge proofs is that with mathematics, I can have your record data prove to me one way or another whether that medicine's safe to take without ever showing me that data, without ever exposing that data. That data can remain encrypted, basically. Essentially.
And Dr. Dunn, does this work for the kinds of algorithmic work that you're working on with COVID-19, something like zero knowledge proofs? Is that something that you guys are working on? Is that a possible approach? Are there limitations to that approach for you?
I mean, I think that's a possible future direction. I would say that one of the reasons why I'm pushing so hard between this distinction of what's research and what's implementation is that we're in such the early days that that's a complexity that I think you would add on top of a digital biomarker algorithm that already works. I don't think we're quite there yet, but you know, if we had a good, strong working product, I think that would be the next layer to look at for sure.
So is there any risk, let's assume we keep the distinction that you have, right, between research and implementation. I think one concern people have is that a lot of data is collected as part of research sets, right? And the stored data that's collected as part of research sets then can become part of the public domain, can be used for other purposes, can be repurposed, especially when it's not your data set, which I know you wouldn't, share out there in the world and put people at harm. But if you're talking about a large corporate entity that's doing the research and collecting the data, if they wait until the kind of implementation phase, if they collected so much information on somebody that there's a risk that information already could be used in discriminatory or other ways. And so I think the question is, at the scale of the research, are there some things that could be done earlier in implementation, earlier than implementation, but as part of the research design? And I hear you, there's this tension, right? Which is, we are all racing to try to find answers, right? I mean, we don't have the luxury of time in the pandemic. But I think to Dr. Gross's point, it's oftentimes at moments like this, right, in a pandemic, in a crisis, when we give up the most liberties that are hard to pull back on, right, that are hard to kind of reverse course. We only have a few minutes, and I want to pick up on a thread that both of you have already mentioned, and I want to make sure we touch upon. You did this important study looking at whether or not there were differences or racial disparities that might arise in the collection of data from wearable devices. And I'm curious what motivated that study. What was it that led you to ask that question to begin with, and what did you find as a result?
Yeah, so we work a lot on the accuracy of devices to understand how we can use the data that's coming off of them. And in our reviews, because we look in the popular media sphere as well as in the scientific literature, we were seeing a lot of anecdotes of people with darker skin saying that these devices don't work as well for me. And when we started to dig into the background behind that, we learned a lot about the wavelength of light that these PPG sensors use. The PPG is that green light on the back of a watch that measures heart rate. And that green light is absorbed more readily by melanin, and people with darker skin have higher melanin content. So there was definitely a basis for this. And on the scientific side of things, people have shown that the light absorption definitely changes based on skin tone. So that motivated us to dig into that question of, do these devices perform as accurately across all different skin tones? And what are other factors that might contribute to inaccuracies? So when we build, because we build algorithms on top of the data to say, what is the quality of every single measurement that we have? And we may need to build in factors on movement levels, for example. And we've seen examples of devices that in their own literature will say, this device is not as accurate in darker skin tones. And to us, that's just unacceptable.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Wow, well, that's really interesting. And I mean, and this plays into the broader point of, you are doing this additional research, you're hoping to be able to distribute the wearables, recognizing that if you're doing it based on self-reporting of people opting in, already we may have a demographic difference in the data that you're collecting. And so have you been collecting the demographic information of the people who are part of the study, and what have you found with respect to the distribution of wearable devices?
Yeah, so we've been reporting blog posts on our study's website, because this is something that we really do want to give back information to participants, to the community, to let people know what we're finding, and also to make a call to action, for people who may be from underserved groups that may have wearable devices, to say, hey, we want to develop technologies in an equitable way, and the only way for us to do that is to have data that's representative of the people. And so, there are a variety of reasons why people may choose not to opt into studies. There's a lot of historical reasons why people of color may be skeptical of research in general, and it's understandable from a researcher's perspective. And so we're trying to kind of balance this really difficult area of wanting to have a very representative population so that we develop equitable technologies, but also understanding why we may not have that representative sample. And we're working really closely with a lot of the institutes at Duke to figure out what the right way is to address that. But if you want to actually see the disparities in the numbers, I mean, they're clear. They're on our website. You can feel free to check it out. And we're always interested in
Can you
hearing
tell
what
our
people
research?
think.
Can you tell our participants here your website address? Where should they go to look at that?
Sure, it's covidentify.org. That's Cov-Identify. And there's a blog link in the upper right-hand corner you can find.
With only a couple minutes left here, I know that there's so much more that we should cover. I want to give you each at least a minute to be able to share with us your thoughts about where we go from here, right? Which is, how do we make ethical progress with respect to the use of wearable devices for the pandemic? And why don't we start with you, Dr. Gross? Thank
you. I mean, the study, I look forward to learning more about your study as well as it progresses. I think that my final point is, one, I am concerned about the reifying the significance of skin color as a biomedically relevant factor. That some of this, just like that's a concern in the back of my mind. In terms of where we're going with all of this, I really want to impress upon everybody that the essentialness of embedding our ethical frameworks and our ethical technological solutions, ethical social solutions like the mediators, like basically having unions for each of these devices that could represent consumer interests, because none of us can do this all on our own. Like, those sorts of considerations are not the kind of thing that you can tack on later. They have to be built into the devices. They have to be built into the algorithms. They have to go in at the ground floor. Otherwise you end up with, you know, trying to, again, it's like we're all retrofitting, you know, new kinds of music onto MIDI, because that was like what we were given for digital music. And that, you know, it's hard to change once you establish a system. So really these considerations need to be embedded, and these novel technologies that fundamentally disprove our collective assumption that privacy and utility of data are necessary trade-offs must be part of that exploration and must be part of our intentional strategy for getting the benefits of these technologies without the many deep, you know, many concerns that we have about what could go wrong.
Ethics by design up front and as part of the development of the product to begin with, and the development of the research to begin with. Dr. Dunn, closing us out.
Yeah, so this has been such an interesting venue for me. I think, like I mentioned at the beginning here, you know, normally I'm presenting in a technical engineering venue, so this is quite different, and a lot of food for thought. And, you know, I really look forward to kind of, as Dr. Gross said, you know, thinking more about the work that we're doing from the standpoint of a bioethicist. And, you know, none of us are sort of the jack of all trades, but it's good to have that open conversation, particularly when we're designing studies, and ideally in times when we are, you know, planning out studies with a little bit more runway, to be able to have these conversations and think about all of the implications and the way we might do that ethics by design from the outset. Definitely. But again, and I guess one last thing I'll mention that Nita, you mentioned at the beginning, was that, you know, there really is a huge benefit for these technologies to potentially prevent the spread of disease. So there's a lot of potential benefits that we hope to realize, and there's this balance that we've got to figure out how to achieve between the bioethics and realizing the benefit of the technology. And I think, like Dr. Gross said, there's really not a it doesn't need to be a trade-off, but we need to find where that balance lives.
As we like to say at Science and Society, good science is responsible science. And we're grateful to both of you for being part of making that happen, to think deeply and carefully about both the facts, the ethics, the policy, and the legal issues with respect to the use of wearable devices in the times of a pandemic. Thank you to both of our panelists, and thank you to everybody for joining us today. Join us next week for our next installment of the Coronavirus Conversations, and have a good evening.